audio recording of Answering the Cry for Freedom, Stories of African Americans and the American Revolution by Gretchen Wolfel, with illustrations by R. Gregory Christie. Chapter 5, Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman, circa 1742 to 1829. This morning, just like every morning, Mumbet teased a blazing fire from the coals in the kitchen fireplace. In the quiet of dawn, she thought about the recent meeting in the Sheffield, Massachusetts town hall. People had crowded in to hear a reading of the new state constitution. It laid out the system of government and the principles behind that government. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Mumbet didn't understand all the words, but she understood free and equal because she wasn't. Mumbet was enslaved. When she finished her morning chores, she began walking the 3 miles from the Ashley farm to the village of Sheffield. She passed farmhouses where farmers and hired hands lived. Farmhands could choose to leave a cruel master. Mumbet had no such choice. At the junction near the village, she crossed the road and walked toward a lawyer's office. She was on a quest for her freedom. Mumbet, born enslaved around 1742 in the Hudson Valley of New York, grew up speaking Dutch. When she was about 14, her owner died and left her to his daughter, Hannah, who had married Colonel John Ashley. Perhaps it was then that Mumbet was torn from her parents and sent to Massachusetts, where people spoke English, a foreign language to her. She carried gifts from her parents that she kept all her life: a long black dress from her father and a short gown from her mother. These weren't fine clothes, but they were precious links to her childhood. Mumbet's new home in Sheffield was owned by John Ashley, the richest man in town. He lived with Hannah, their 3 daughters, and 1 son. Ashley's 4 enslaved men lived in a room in the barn, and Mumbet lived in a small room next to the kitchen. When Mumbet gave birth to a daughter, Lizzie, she shared the room with her mother. The Ashley women worked alongside Mumbet, cooking, spinning, and sewing. But the heavy work, doing laundry, making soap, and scrubbing floors, was left to Mumbet. She didn't mind hard work, but Hannah Ashley's sharp tongue was harder to bear. Hannah was called a shrew untamable and the most despotic of mistresses. Hannah tested Mumbet's good nature every single day. Waiting and watching. One day, Mumbet was making bread as she did each week. She mixed and kneaded the dough and shoveled hot coals into the brick oven built in the fireplace. When the bread had risen, Mumbet shoveled out the coals and placed the bread in the oven to bake. Lizzie mixed pieces of leftover dough to make her own little loaf of bread. Just then, Hannah Ashley entered the room and screamed at the girl, "Thief!" She raised the hot coal shovel and swung it at Lizzie. Mumbet's arm shot out to take the blow, which cut to the bone. The wound was slow to heal, but she refused to cover it. "I had a bad arm all winter, but Madam had the worst of it," Mumbet said. "I never covered the wound, and when people said to me before Madam, 'Why, Betty, what ails your arm?' I only answered, 'Ask Mrs.' Hannah Ashley couldn't break the woman's spirit, but slavery weighed heavily on Mumbet. She said, any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand 1 minute on God's earth a free woman, I would." Birth of a revolution. Ideas of freedom were stirring in Colonel Ashley's world as well. In the 1760s, people in Boston protested against new British taxes on American colonists who had been governing and taxing themselves for 150 years. Echoes of the uproar Echoes of the uproar reached quiet Sheffield, but Colonel Ashley and his friends were conservative country landowners, not Boston radicals. When revolutionary talk spread throughout the colonies, they were finally convinced. The town's leaders gathered in Colonel Ashley's study in January 1773. Mumbet heard them argue about the issues as she served them food and drink. At the end of all their talk, an ambitious young lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick wrote down their declaration to send to Boston. Mumbet couldn't read the Sheffield resolves, but she understood the words. Quote, "Resolved that mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other, and have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and property." End quote. Mumbet had no property, except the clothes on her back and those her parents had given her. She had no liberty either, but she certainly longed for it. The resolves went on, quote, "Resolved that the great end of political society is to secure in a more effectual manner those rights and privileges wherewith God and nature have made us free." End quote. Did Colonel Ashley and the others believe that Mumbet had the right to be free? Would their political society, the government, help her secure her rights? The radical ideas in the Sheffield Resolves were just words, not law. So Mumbet watched and waited. She watched as Massachusetts joined the 12 other American colonies and declared independence from Britain in 1776. She watched local Sheffield men go off to war to secure that independence. She waited until Massachusetts wrote a constitution in 1780, and she went to town to hear it read. Quote, Article 1. All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. End quote. Mumbet knew her waiting was over. Those grand ideas of Colonel Ashley's and his friends were now the law. Would she dare to test them? She would. She walked into the office of Theodore Sedgwick, the young lawyer who wrote down the Sheffield Resolves. "Sir," said she, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are born equal, and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" Sedgwick was not rich and powerful like John Ashley. Would he dare to oppose Ashley in court? He would. Because Mumbet was a woman, Sedgwick wanted to strengthen his case by adding Brom, a male slave owned by Ashley, to the lawsuit. Freedom on trial. First, the county court sent to Colonel Ashley a notice called a writ of replevin, demanding that he release his property. He refused. The court sent another writ, and again he refused. Then the court summoned him to appear, and on August 21st, 1781, Mumbet faced her owner in the courtroom. If she won, she would be free. If she lost, her life could be harder than ever. There is no record of what the lawyers said at her trial, but the jury, all white men, were convinced by Mumbet's lawyers, and the judge ruled that Mumbet and Brom were free. Not only that, Colonel Ashley also was required to pay the two freed slaves 30 shillings for their long years of labor. Small though this amount was, it recognized people's right to be paid for their work. Before Mumbet's case, other Massachusetts slaves had sued for their freedom. They had been promised freedom by owners who then broke that promise, or they were beaten and took their masters to court for assault. But the Ashleys had made no promise of freedom, and Mumbet did not prosecute Mrs. Ashley for the beating she gave Mumbet. It was slavery itself that Mumbet challenged, and she won. Other Massachusetts judges accepted the verdict in her case, and 2 years after Mumbet's trial, a judge decreed that slavery was unconstitutional in Massachusetts. 7 years later, the 1790 state census recorded slaves, 0. Mumbet had helped to free her daughter, too, and more than 5,000 people. After the 1781 trial, Brom disappeared from history, but Catherine Sedgwick, Theodore's daughter, wrote a memoir that included many stories about Mumbet. In one of her first acts as a free woman, she returned to the courthouse to give herself a new name, Elizabeth Freeman. She left the Ashleys and set forth seeking and obtaining her safety and happiness. Living free. Freeman went to work for her lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, in nearby Stockbridge. Though she was hired as a housekeeper, for the next 27 years she became much more. Mrs. Sedgwick suffered from severe depression, and Freeman nursed her, comforting her better than anyone else could. In addition, Freeman became a second mother to the 7 Sedgwick children and worked as a midwife, delivering babies in the town. Freeman's nurturing skills were widely known, but it took an armed rebellion in 1786 to bring forth her iron will and nerves of steel. Farmers in western Massachusetts armed themselves and fought against the lawyers and judges who were taking away their farms when they couldn't pay their debts. Theodore Sedgwick became a target of their attacks. In late February 1787, he was in Boston on business and his family fled from Stockbridge. They left Freeman alone to guard their home. She gathered the Sedgwick silver and jewelry and hid it inside her own trunk, under her dresses and petticoats. When armed marauders banged at the door, Freeman let them in to stop them from destroying the house. They ransacked the place, searching for Sedgwick, jabbing their bayonets under the beds and into the closets. When they couldn't find Sedgwick, they searched the cellar and found a supply of liquor. Freeman gave them some of the worst-tasting beer, which they spat out. Then they climbed to the attic and found Freeman's trunk, secured with a padlock. They demanded the key from her. She refused. They hurled racial insults at her. She replied that if they wanted to rob a poor Negro woman's trunk, they would have to break it open. They left her trunk alone, with all the Sedgwick valuables inside. An unarmed woman foiled these men who had terrorized whole towns. In 1807, when Mrs. Sedgwick died and the children were grown, Freeman retired. She had saved enough money to buy a small house and a few acres of land in the hills outside Stockbridge. Her daughter, Lizzie, had children, and they had children, Freeman's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Freeman lived among them for the rest of her life. Catherine Sedgwick, who wrote down some of her memories of Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman, also wrote a touching epitaph for Freeman's tombstone in the Sedgwick family plot. Elizabeth Freeman, known by the name of Mumbet, died December 28, 1829. Her supposed age was 85 years. She was born a slave and remained a slave for nearly 30 years. She could neither read nor write. Yet in her own sphere she had no superior nor equal. She never violated a truth nor failed to perform a duty. In every situation of domestic trial, she was the most efficient helper and the tenderest friend. Good mother, farewell. Though Freeman lived far from Boston, she understood the principles that fired up the revolutionaries. Acting on those principles, she managed to free herself and thousands more and set about seeking her happiness, just as the Massachusetts Constitution had decreed.